Shalom, little one. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's continue with our story in Shemot Exodus. Moshe stood at the entrance of the tent, his staff in hand. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the desert sands. The night before, he had spoken with Elohim, and now the time had come. It was time to stand before Pharaoh once more. Time to deliver the warning. Time for the first sign. He turned and saw Aharon waiting for him, his brother, his voice, the man Elohim had sent to stand beside him. Moshe gave a small nod. Aharon returned it, and together they set out for Pharaoh's palace. The halls of Pharaoh's throne room were as grand as before, tall, imposing, lined with statues of gods carved from stone. The air was filled with the scent of incense and oil, and golden light flickered from the torches that lined the walls. Pharaoh sat upon his throne, his robe gleaming in the morning light. He had not forgotten Moshe's words. The demand had been clear: "Let my people go." But Pharaoh had refused, and now Moshe and Aharon stood before him again. A silence settled over the room as Pharaoh leaned forward. His eyes were sharp, piercing. He studied them with a mixture of amusement and irritation. And then Moshe spoke. "The Elohim of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, 'Let my people go, that they may serve me.' But you have not listened. Now Elohim says this: 'By this you shall know that I am Elohim.'" Aharon stepped forward. He lifted his staff. Pharaoh watched, his expression unreadable. Then Aharon threw the staff to the ground. The wood struck the stone floor and moved. The staff twisted, lengthened, its wooden form shifting before their eyes. Gasps filled the room as it coiled, dark and glistening, its body winding over the floor. A serpent. The servants nearest to Pharaoh staggered back, eyes wide with fear. Pharaoh's gaze flickered to the creature, but then a smirk. He lifted a hand. At his command, his magicians stepped forward. Their robes rustled as they reached into their sleeves, pulling forth their own staffs. They whispered words, low and rhythmic, speaking in the name of their gods. Then, one by one, they threw down their staffs, and before the eyes of the court, theirs too became serpents. The magicians straightened, glancing at one another, smugness creeping into their expressions. Pharaoh leaned back into his throne, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. But then a heron serpent struck. It lunged, its dark body snapping forwards, sinking its fangs into the magician's serpents, and devoured them whole. The room fell silent. The magicians' faces paled. Their serpents, their symbols of power, had been swallowed up. The message was clear, but Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He waved a hand, dismissing Moshe and Aharon as though nothing had happened. And still, he refused to let the people go. The next morning, Moshe and Aharon stood beside the devour, the great river of Mitzrayim. Pharaoh walked toward the water, his robes flowing behind him, his servants trailing at a respectful distance. It was his morning ritual. He stepped to the edge, where the waters stretched wide, shimmering in the early light. And there, standing on the banks, waiting for him, were Moshe and Aharon. Pharaoh's eyes darkened. Again they had come before him. Again they made their demands. He had not listened before, and he would not listen now. But Moshe spoke. "This is what Elohim says. By this you shall know that I am Elohim. Behold, I will strike the waters of the river with the staff in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood." Pharaoh's mouth twisted into a scowl. Ridiculous. The river had been there since the days of his fathers, since the time of his ancestors. It was their life source, the gift of the gods. No one could touch the devour, no one. But Moshe raised his hand. Aharon lifted his staff, and he struck the water. For a breath, nothing happened. Then a ripple spread across the surface. The water darkened. The blue waves shifted to red. Pharaoh's servants gasped, stepping backward, their sandals splashing against the banks. The fish rose lifeless to the surface. The scent of iron filled the air. The river, once pure, reeked of death. Pharaoh's eyes widened as the red stain spread. The people of Mitzrayim ran to their wells, their jars, their basins. But every vessel of water had turned to blood. Aharon lowered his staff. Moshe watched Pharaoh carefully. Would this be enough? Would he see the power of Elohim? Would he let the people go? But then, Pharaoh called for his magicians. They came forward, speaking in hushed tones, whispering to their gods. And through their secret arts, they took water from another vessel and made it appear as blood. Pharaoh smirked. He turned away, and he hardened his heart. For 7 days the waters of Mitzrayim remained blood. The people suffered. The land stank. Yet Pharaoh refused to listen. The waters of the devour bore the stench of death. The Nile had run red with blood for 7 days. The fish had rotted in the sun. The wells had been emptied. The people of Mitzrayim had groaned in thirst, digging along the river banks, searching desperately for clean water. And yet, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He had not let the people go. And so, Moshe and Aharon stood before him once more. The throne room was as grand as ever. Incense burned in golden braziers. Servants knelt at Pharaoh's feet, and the magician stood silently at his side. Pharaoh's face was impassive, his eyes cold. He was waiting to see what Moshe would say next. The last time, it had been blood in the water, but this time, Moshe lifted his gaze. This is what Elohim says: "Let my people go, that they may serve me. If you refuse, I will plague your land with frogs." A hush fell over the room. Frogs? Pharaoh smirked. What kind of plague was that? Surely Moshe's Elohim had greater signs to show. Pharaoh lifted his hand, dismissing them. He had hardened his heart. So Moshe and Aharon turned and left the palace. And the moment they were gone, Aharon lifted his staff over the waters of Mitzrayim, and the frogs came forth. It started at the river banks. The water bubbled, rippling, shifting, and then the frogs emerged. One, then another, then thousands, tens of thousands. They poured onto the land, their green bodies slick with water, their limbs springing forward in great leaps. The first servants of Pharaoh laughed, stepping back as a few landed at their feet. But then they kept coming, more and more, until the fields turned green with movement. The frogs hopped into the streets, covering the paths, leaping through open doors. They climbed onto the beds of Pharaoh's people, into their ovens, into their bowls, into their very food. Women screamed. Men tried to sweep them away. But for every frog that was cast out, 100 more took its place. The once mighty kingdom of Mitzrayim belonged to the frogs. And then, at last, Pharaoh could endure it no longer. He sent for Moshe and Aharon. They returned to the palace, stepping through halls where frogs crouched in every shadow. Even the great Pharaoh sat stiffly upon his throne, a frog perched upon his armrest, croaking at his ear. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching in irritation. At last he spoke. "Pray to your Elohim to take away the frogs from me and my people. Then I will let the people go." Moshe studied him carefully. Pharaoh had hardened his heart before. Would he truly let them go now? Moshe nodded. I will pray, and the frogs will leave. But know this, Pharaoh, there is none like our Elohim. Pharaoh said nothing. He simply waited. That evening, Moshe prayed, and by morning, the frogs were dead. Their lifeless bodies filled the streets, piled high in the corners of homes, heaped in the fields where grain once grew. The people of Mitzrayim worked tirelessly, gathering them into great mounds, and the land stank. Pharaoh stood at his window, watching as the people labored. He had cried out for relief, and relief had come. But now that the frogs were gone, now that the suffering had lifted, Pharaoh's heart hardened again, and he refused to let the people go. The third plague lies upon the land. Moshe and Aaron returned to Pharaoh. Again, they delivered the command, "Let my people go." Again, Pharaoh refused. So Elohim gave Moshe another command. This time, there would be no warning. Aaron struck the dust of the ground with his staff, and at once, the dust rose into the air. It spread over the land, carried by the wind, swirling into the villages and homes. And when it settled, it became lice. The tiny creatures crawled onto every man and beast. They bit at their skin, swarming over them, filling their hair, covering their bodies. The people of Mitzrayim cried out, scratching at their flesh, but there was no escape. Pharaoh called for his magicians. "Do the same," he commanded. The magicians whispered their spells, stretching out their hands over the dust. But this time, nothing happened. The magicians failed. They turned to Pharaoh, their faces pale, their voices hushed. "This is the finger of Elohim," they murmured. But Pharaoh would not listen, and his heart remained hard. The next morning, Moshe stood before Pharaoh. "This is what Elohim says. Let my people go that they may serve me. If you refuse, I will send swarms of flies upon you, upon your servants, upon your people, and into your houses. The houses of Mitzrayim shall be filled with them. But in the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, there shall be none." Pharaoh's expression darkened. Another plague. But this one would be different. The people of Mitzrayim would suffer, but the children of Israel would be spared. Moshe lifted his staff, and the flies came, thick black clouds of them. They poured into the homes, into the temples, into Pharaoh's palace itself. They buzzed in his ears, covered his arms, landed in his food. Pharaoh clenched his fists. He could not bear it. He called for Moshe and Aaron. "Go," he said quickly. "Go, sacrifice to your Elohim, but do it here, in the land." Moshe shook his head. "Our sacrifices are an abomination to the Mitzrites. If we offer them here, your people will stone us. We must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness." Pharaoh exhaled sharply. He thought for a long moment. Then, "Go, but do not go far." Moshe nodded, and as soon as he prayed, the flies were gone. Pharaoh looked around, taking in the silence, the stillness of the air. The plagues had lifted. The suffering had ended, and once again, his heart hardened, and he refused to let the people go. Until next time, Laila Tov, little one, Shalom.